Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, going to be joined by Andrew Dukowitz of Zone Coverage. We're going to talk a lot of Donte DiVincenzo. We'll talk about his injury and also the trickle-down effect of the Timberwolves rotation, what we've seen so far through 4 DiVincenzo-less games. We'll also talk about the upcoming trade deadline. Does Andrew think the Timberwolves will do anything? What may they look to do at the deadline? We'll also preview Wolves Nuggets. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. The Timberwolves are back in action tomorrow. They actually get the rare double off day, and then they get to play 2 straight games at Target Center, which hasn't happened in like 6 weeks, or at least over a month. Wolves have Denver tomorrow afternoon on ABC. We're going to talk about that a little bit later today. The whole show is going to be myself and Andrew Dukowitz from Zone Coverage. We're going to cover quite a bit. We're going to talk a lot of Timberwolves rotation. We'll talk trade deadline. We'll talk DiVincenzo's injury. We'll talk about Wolves Nuggets. So packed show today. Big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder, you can sign up for the daily Locked On Wolves newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. Again, LockedOnDaily.com. You can get all things Wolves. You can get some around the NBA, national news, some other Wolves links beyond Locked On Wolves, all to your inbox. Again, LockedOnDaily.com. All right, we're going to go ahead and bring Andrew in. Without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Andrew Dukowitz of Zone Coverage. All right, joined now by Andrew Dukowitz of Zone Coverage. We're going to talk about a lot today. We're going to talk a lot about the post Donte DiVincenzo Timberwolves, or at least post relatively serious injury for DiVincenzo. I guess we could start there. I know you wrote about this for Zone Coverage, and you know, like I think the other day when it broke, I think maybe on MLK Day, right before the Wolves played Memphis, that it was going to be a more serious injury. And so I never really gave a lot of time to that on the show and like what it was, why it was so serious, when everybody, I think, right away assumed like, sprained big toe, like he'll be back in a few days. But it's not quite that unserious, is it?
No, it's I mean, I'll preface by saying my day job, in addition to being a beat reporter for the Wolves, is I'm an RN that deals a lot with like rehab, wounds, stuff like that. But dug into it, it sounds like it's commonly called turf toe. If football fans hear it, probably a lot more. Same with soccer fans. But essentially, it's a strain of the big toe, kind of right where the meaty part of the big toe connects to the foot. And unfortunately, with that type of injury, there's not really anything you can do for it. It's kind of like cracking a rib. You just have to deal with it. What's unfortunate is it's a grade 3 strain. So that means that the ligament's almost completely torn through. Grade 4 is it's gone, but grade 3 is it's almost a complete tear. So if Donte were to try and like push through it, he risks tearing the entire ligament, and then he needs surgery. It's a really unfortunate thing, because again, ligaments, you can't do anything for them. They're really slow healing, and he could be out anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to done for the year. And both of those are just as likely. I mean, we might not see Donte again for the season. He could be back in late February. But what must be driving him crazy is the only thing you can do is put it in a boot and just stay off of it as much as possible. So I doubt we'll be seeing him at a lot of games. And my guess is he's just going to be kind of sitting there waiting for that thing to heal.
Yeah, and I'm assuming the Wolves will just I guess I don't know how often they would go back and MRI it, but probably every 3 weeks or so, I would think, and just kind of one of those wait and see how quickly it heals.
Yeah, for you and me, it's probably like an MRI every couple months. For Donte, I'd be surprised if they were I mean, every 2 or 3 weeks, they're probably getting a new look at that to see where he's at and where they can rehab it.
Well, and since he went out, of course, that happened at the end of the Warriors game a little over a week ago, which unfortunately came right before they played the Knicks in what would have been his return to Madison Square Garden. And so what we've seen from a rotation standpoint is Mike Conley, of course, step back into the starting lineup where he had just been replaced by DiVincenzo like 4 or 5 games prior to the injury. And the Wolves are 2-2 since the DiVincenzo injury. They beat the Knicks and they just barely beat the Mavs last time out. And then in between, of course, they lost that close game to the Grizzlies on MLK Day, and they lost to the Cavs at home last Saturday. So they've certainly been competitive without him. But what we've seen is like I said, Conley get back in the starting lineup. We've seen obviously more Rob Dillingham, and by that I mean like just period rotation minutes for Rob Dillingham. Not a whole lot else has changed rotation wise, except at least not in the backcourt. Weirdly, like at the same time, we're seeing the front court rotation kind of even out a little bit less Rudy, a little bit more Nas, a little bit less Julius Randle. But in terms of the backcourt, and I guess overall lineups, what have you seen the Timberwolves do adjustment wise in the wake of the DiVincenzo injury to kind of I guess change things up out of necessity?
I mean, they've been doing, like you said, Rob's come in the first 3 games. He was playing 15, 20 minutes. I think they kind of got exposed a little bit with the Mavericks where Rob came in there and Kyrie, I mean, even Spencer Dinwiddie immediately were hunting him on screens. And I want to say, I can't remember fully off head, but I want to say he was like double digits negative for the Dallas game in just 9 minutes. I think that's the hope, is that now that there is this rotation spot open, we're probably going to see a lot more similar to what Conley and Tim Conley, that is, and Chris Finch had for Rob at the beginning of the year. I think they wanted him to be kind of in this position where he's getting those backup point guard minutes. It sucks that it comes at the cost of Donte getting injured, especially with how hot he's been. But at least we're going to see what Rob can do. And in 3 out of those 4 games, I mean, he's electric. He brings a different energy. He pushes the ball. His passing vision is way better than I think most people realized. And defense, he just works his tail off, which, I mean, there's a lot of guys in the NBA that aren't running full speed into screens and full court pressing all 15 minutes they're out there. And it seems like Rob really does work when he's out on the court, which, being at Wolves practices, I can say he also works at practices. He's always getting in work.
Yeah, and he no doubt has been told by the coaching staff, and he no doubt knows. I've talked about this on the show before, but he has to put forth that effort because of the defensive deficiencies he showed in his 1 year at Kentucky, and then also because of his size, right? Like guys that are undersized have to put forth even more effort to kind of make up for that, fair or unfair. I mean, I guess it is fair, but like that's going to have to be something he's really great at, is trying very hard defensively. You can't be small and not try defensively, or you're just never going to see the floor. And you mentioned, this being it's too bad that it came at the expense of an injury, but this is kind of what a lot of folks said near the beginning of the year, was like, he might not be in the rotation now, but over the course of a long season, the Wolves have been very fortunate. Even last year, and other than the DiVincenzo injury this year, been fortunate on the injury front, knock on wood, and they haven't needed to dip into their depth too much. And inevitably there was going to be an opportunity for him because of that. And now out of necessity, he's playing more, and out of necessity, he only played 9 minutes, as you said, against Dallas. It was partly the matchup, partly Dallas was just trying to hunt that matchup. And the other thing with Dillingham, I said this on the post-game podcast, I guess it would have been Thursday's show. He has to just like step in and make shots. Like it's not fair, but that's the life of a bench guy. And especially if he's going to be at best an average defender, he has to be on from the moment he steps on the floor. And like you said, he was the first 3 games, right? Like he shot 4 of 6 against the Knicks. He was 5 of 10 against Cleveland and 6 of 8 against Memphis. If you shoot 50% or greater, Chris Finch is going to find a spot for you on the floor. But if you come out and you miss a couple shots immediately and they're hunting you defensively and it's a close game, it's going to be a little bit harder to find those consistent minutes if you're Rob Dillingham.
Well, and it's interesting because Joe Ingles actually spoke on it earlier in the season of like that 8.5, 9th man spot is just, I mean, you're playing in the NBA, right? So it's not all bad, but like it does kind of suck that you get put into a game, you're going to get 7 to 8 minutes. If you miss 2 shots, you're done. And that's just the life of that spot. And I think some of that came in with Rob earlier in the season, where they probably did look at that and say, is this going to do more harm than good if we put Rob in, game 3 and he misses 3 shots and we pull him? Or is it better to just not play him and put Joe in? I think now it's a time where, I'm sure fans feel it. I'm sure you feel it. I feel it. There is like a sense of urgency with this team where if they want to make a run and still, potentially do damage in the playoffs, they got to start winning games. And it's to a point now where like, they got to see what they got in Rob. The weird thing with me, and I wanted to ask your thoughts on it, is Josh Minot like completely falling out of the rotation. And he was playing some pretty good basketball. So I'm going to Wolves practice tomorrow, and I kind of intend to ask a round about it. But I wonder what are your thoughts? Why did Josh get taken out?
Yeah, I mean, he played in the first game after the DiVincenzo injury, the Knicks game. He played like 7 minutes, and I remember it not being a good stint. He missed a 3. He didn't really do anything else. I actually just pulled it up. He played 7 minutes. He didn't have any rebounds. And it was just 0 for 2 from the field, 0 for 1 from 3. He did have a steal, but like was basically just did nothing for 7 minutes statistically. But it's also like, it wasn't like I don't know that he's ever been like actively bad. It's just, the same sort of, it's exactly what you were just talking about. What Joe Ingles said and what we've seen with Dillingham is, you got to make the most of those minutes. And it's tough because if you don't, then like you're back on the bench. And I don't think he's played in the 3 games since then. I don't think he played against Cleveland or the last 2 times out. A little bit of it could be matchups, but in theory, Minot is one of those guys that can play against any opponent because he's an energy guy. He's a defender. He's long. He's athletic. He just is supposed to give you all that extra stuff. And Chris Finch has gone back to a shorter rotation. And we talked, or I mentioned off the top a little bit about how the big man minutes have sort of evened out. And so he's playing, I think, a little bit more 2 center lineups, and it just kind of trickles down where there's just a few less of those extra minutes to go around. I still think Josh Minot is like a really nice 9th player in a rotation because of all the ancillary stuff he does, and he doesn't need the ball in his hands. Problem is he's got to hit the corner 3 when he gets the chance. And like we've identified, it's tough when you get 1 attempt, in a game and you got to knock it down. And if you don't, it's like, well, he didn't do his job. But that's just the reality of it. And I'm hoping he gets back into the rotation because I do think that there's a rotation player in there. I've always kind of said he's like a light version of Brandon Clark in what I think he can do if he's given the minutes. That's the type of player I think he is. But yeah, I mean, I'm a big Josh Minot fan.
Yeah, he's a super good dude too. So it did kind of, anytime it's, and not that like any of the Wolves are like bad dudes, but there's just guys that you kind of root for. Like Nikhil's has a special place for me that I'll root for him until he's probably in his 70s. But Minot's another one where it's just like, man, I hope it works out for him, whether it's here, there, later on this season. I just hope he gets a chance to really get some run.
All right. Next, I want to get into the, let's talk a little bit about the, I guess a couple more lineup combo things. And we'll talk a little bit trade deadline too. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets. If you win your first bet, that's $300 to keep the action going. As of right now, there's no line yet on Wolves Nuggets on Saturday, but we'll keep an eye on that. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings, whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs. FanDuel has you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. Get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, a couple additional rotation notes real quickly. I looked up all the non-Donte DiVincenzo lineups, so anything with him off the court so far this season. Of course, the most used lineup is the I guess what is now again the starting lineup, that was the starting lineup to start the season. Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, Randle, Gobert. Besides that, there aren't very many good ones without DiVincenzo on the floor. And this is something that we've talked about. I think the last time you were on the show a few weeks ago, we talked about this, and something I've talked about a lot at Locked On Wolves is that kind of the bench trio of DiVincenzo, Naz Reid, and Nikhil were like, every lineup with those three was great. And like the only good non-DiVincenzo lineup that's played significant possessions has played about 200 possessions, just under. And it's Edwards, Alexander Walker, McDaniels, Randle, and Gobert, which surprised me because there's no Naz Reid in that lineup. And it just, I don't know, that just to me was a little bit of an odd lineup to be successful. And the two that besides the regular starting lineup, the two that have played the most, over 100 possessions, other than the one I just mentioned, both do have Naz Reid, and they're both like -12, and the other one's -18, 15th and 12th percentile overall units, respectively. So part of it is just the type of player Donte is. He's a solid switchable defender. He's a really good shooter who is starting to come on. He can score off the dribble. He's an active participant on the glass. He's good with those 50-50 balls and long rebounds that some Wolves guards and wings struggle with. But I have some concern about him being like, he's almost like the perfect connective tissue, the perfect role player. And so for an extended period of time, just removing that from the lineup, it's going to be up to Chris Finch to find these right combinations of guys, sans DiVincenzo, that can at least bridge the gap until he gets back.
Yeah, I think one of the lineups that I'm hopeful they go back to more without Donte in there is last year's starting lineup without Cat. I mean, that one with Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jaden, Naz, and Gobert. I mean, net rating of plus 27.7. They play really well defensively, defensive rating in the 90s. That being said, they've only played 50 minutes together this year. And that's compared to, I think they were over 200 last year with the Cat injury factored in. Other than that, they just got to start mixing up and just trying more things. I think Finch was really intentional, especially after Donte got into the starting lineup, of pairing Donte with Randle. And those two had like quite a bit of success. And then they would bring in, Mike and Naz off the bench to get that old lineup back in. I'm not really sure what they do. The starting lineup that they have, I think it has a net rating of like 0.1 in the positive, which net rating is your offensive rating minus your defensive rating. Ratings are how many points you would score / give up over 100 possessions in a game, for people that are listening. But essentially, the issue with that lineup is they play so slow that their rating is fine because they just limit the possessions to such an extent that as long as they don't turn it over, they can kind of just grind out minutes, which is great. But as we're seeing in these late game situations, when you got players like Kyrie on the other side, or Rudy plays 38 minutes and is a little tired at the end of the game and can't rebound as well. I don't know if that's the reason, but other teams just have these lineups that can push the pace, get turnovers, and really take advantage of this slow half-court kind of methodical offense-defense that the Wolves run with their starters. I'm hopeful Rob, if he gets extended minutes, can change that, because that guy's always looking to push the pace. Naz Reid also, I mean, it's kind of uncanny that Naz and Randle both do get the rebound and kind of push it without passing to an outlet. But Naz Reid just does it so much faster and with so much more energy. The other thing I noticed from last night is just Jaden was out running in transition quite a bit more. So maybe that's part of the answer too, is just when you have that slow lineup, you have guys like Jaden or Ant just leaking out to try and get something going in the fast break. But to me, that's the biggest issue with their lineups right now, is just their main 5 starters just play so slow together.
Yeah. And I just talked about this the other day. Like it's something actually I've talked about for a long time, is that especially in the non-Rudy minutes, like it would behoove the Wolves to just play faster, because like you mentioned, they've got a lot of the personnel to do it, and their offense isn't good enough in the half court to score consistently. We have enough evidence now to say that that's true. It hasn't changed, but yet they're actually good in transition when they do run. Like all the numbers suggest like they're successful when they run. They just don't run enough. They don't run off of rebounds ever. They're only really running when they turn defenses over, which kind of comes and goes. So yeah, I mean, I agree. And Dillingham, I think, will naturally do that. Ant tends to slow things down, but when Dillingham's on the floor, I think that's going to, Jaden did a lot of his damage against the Mavs in transition and in the secondary break or semi transition, when it was like, it's a little bit of a slower fast break, but you're still not working out of a half court set. And that's something I agree. I think they should do more of. Now, Dante's good at pushing pace. He likes to shoot threes off the dribble and transition. He's really good at it, but he's also good at scoring in the half court. And it's just one less talented offensive player that defenses have to worry about. And I made the case the other day on the show that one of the reasons all the Rob Dillingham, Anthony Edwards lineups are so good together, like Rob overall, a lot of the numbers aren't great with him on the floor. Obviously, the body work is a lot of garbage time and some really early season stuff, limited minutes. But with Ant, he's been legit great. Not in the Mavs game, but besides that, great. And I think a big part of that is all the attention paid to Ant, and Rob's one of the few guys that can actually make opponents pay for loading up on Anthony Edwards. I mean, it's basically Rob and it's Naz Reid and sometimes Julius Randle. And that's kind of it. And DiVincenzo's another guy that should have success doing that, but without him on the floor, it's going to be up to Rob Dillingham to add something there. All right. So this is a bit of an abrupt transition, but I did want to talk about trade deadline. And we're just a couple weeks away now that the deadline's earlier in February. And so I just kind of wanted to put it out there. Like, I haven't talked about it at all yet on the show. And it's been a while. I think at one point early in the season when everybody was like really upset about how things are going with Julius Randle, I think there's been some better moments since then, but there's like this overall clamoring among the Wolves fan base related to the possibility of a Julius Randle trade. And I think there's been some, like, everybody's just kind of said, hey, it could happen. But at the same time, it feels pretty unlikely. There's the player option that we should say that he has for next year. So he could always opt in if to the Wolves, or if the Wolves trade him to his new organization. So it's not a true expiring contract. And, whoever gets him or the Wolves have to consider the possibility of an extension. And does that make sense? Or do you let him walk for nothing if he opts out? Like, there's so many different ways this can go because of the player option. And, you're just upsetting the apple cart again for the second time in 4 or 5 months if you do end up trading Julius Randle. So obviously they could also make other trades, although it's unlikely just with the way the books are shaping or are currently shaped. But what's your overall take on the upcoming deadline? What do you think the odds are the Wolves make a trade? And if so, what do you think they're most likely to look to do?
I know, like, fans, and I hear it on Twitter. I hear it from people in the stands. Fans want something to change with this team, and I can't blame them. I mean, they're a 500 team after going to the Western Conference Finals. I hate to be the guy that might disappoint everyone, but I think there's maybe like a 10% chance they make a trade. I think, first, the things that make it really hard is, they're in the second apron. They can't aggregate players. So if they trade out Julius, it can only be Julius. If they wanted to, make a trade for like De'Aaron Fox, they would have to shed $17 million in salary cap and then trade Julius Randle for De'Aaron Fox, just because De'Aaron Fox makes like a couple $100,000 more than Julius does. The other thing is, like you said, I mean, they are just now starting to kind of figure out what lineups work together, how this kind of gels. A lot of the players have kind of talked about it, of just how difficult it is to learn how to play next to Rudy Gobert. Do you really want to bring in another forward or another center that isn't familiar with him? And then, Randle, for all of the ISOs and turnovers, and I wrote about it a few weeks ago, of just like, he's unfortunately one of the worst ISO players in the league. Turnover percentage wise, 1 out of 4 ISOs, he has a turnover. That being said, I mean, he is a walking 20 points a night. I mean, he's too good for a tanking team to want to trade for him because he can win them games. And if you're a contender, do you look at Julius Randle and think that he's the missing piece? If you're a Miami, does he get added in the Jimmy Butler trade and that's facilitated somehow? All that's to say, I think it's pretty unlikely. I think my dream trade, if they did trade him, would be to get like a backup big whether it's like a Miles Turner from Indiana, Robert Williams from Portland, and then just like a flyer wing. I mean, two role players that, you know, you can start Nas, you got another guy off the bench. I think the other thing that makes it really tricky for the Wolves is they really can't take long-term money back unless they're going to sacrifice signing Nikhil or Nas Reed, which I'm in the camp that I think a big part of the Cat trade was so they could reward those players at the end of this season. But if they take back like a 3-year, $60 million contract, now one of those guys you have to let go, which then why did you do the Cat trade? You know, you could have just kind of kept Cat and lost one of those guys. So all that's to say, if the trade happens, I think it'll be a refreshing point for the fans. But I think the team's looking at it of, we're just starting to figure this out. Let's just see how the rest of the season goes, see what we can do in the postseason, and then we'll reset for next year.
Yeah, I do think that if there wasn't a player option, it might be easier to, because obviously it takes two to tango, and the flip side of that, as I've said many times on the show, is it only takes one team to be interested in a trade for a player. But I think like a rebuilding team isn't necessarily going to take on the contract. Plus, as you mentioned, you can't aggregate salaries, so it has to be just a one-out trade. So like a rebuilding team isn't going to take him on and send you picks or whatever and try and match the salary because, well, first of all, the Wolves wouldn't have the roster spots, and there's also like, and then also Julius Randle could opt in for a rebuilding team, and then they're stuck with his contract. Although I guess you could trade the expiring that next year, and then a contending team probably isn't going to want Julius Randle for the same reasons the Wolves may look to trade him, just depending on fit. And he's just a big piece to move without him. Like there's certain players that are plug and play almost anywhere, like Donte DiVincenzo is a good example. And we still saw the type of, not learning curve, but adjustment period it took DiVincenzo in Minnesota. Randall's much less plug and play, as we've also seen. He plays a very specific way, and good teams may not want to rock the boat in season. So it's not as simple as just, hey, we'll trade you Julius Randle. He was an all-star last year. Like, it's not probably going to be quite that easy. To argue for trading him for almost anything, if you can, I guess it's like, hey, if this team's a 500 team, if you need Julius Randle to be at 500, then like, where's this team going anyway, sort of a thing. But there's also like the guys on the team are people too. And so to rock the boat once again and maybe not get any better, but possibly get worse doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If this is the best possible version of the team for the rest of the season, then you might as well, you don't want to waste a year of Ant's almost prime, right? Like he's headed into his prime. You don't want to just kind of punt and be like, all right, well, we'll figure it out next year. You know, you just got to kind of see how it shakes out. So yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think it's unlikely they make a trade. They're really unlikely to do anything else for all the reasons you mentioned. They're just like limited in terms of assets to trade, and obviously no cap space, roster spots, etc. It's just like there's not a whole lot they can do, period. Here headed into the deadline. It's unlike like last year, right? Like last year they made the Monte Morris deal and they could send out 2 and bring back 1, and that's what they did. And we're not going to see something like that this year.
I think the other thing with the Randle side of it is, you know, you keep him for the rest of the year if he opts into his contract because Rudy's pay cut, quote unquote, but because Rudy's taking a discount on his next contract, because Nikhil's expiring, because Nas is likely to opt out of his player option, that dips you under the second apron. So then you can do a sign and trade with Randle, or you can aggregate players and trade Randle and use that salary spot. There are things you can do if he opts in after the season for that deal. I mean, honestly, I was looking at it last night, and I think there's teams out there that are going to pay him $30-40 million for 2 or 3 seasons. So I don't think there's really a risk that he's going to opt in. I think, you know, it, and then to your point, other players, I mean, I've seen stuff, people floating out like ideal Jaden trades, but it's kind of the same thing where would you rather just have Jaden who you know, or would you rather get someone like Jaden that makes $19 million a year that we don't know? Nikhil got aggregated a little bit out there on Twitter, and I think someone from ESPN tweeted out that teams were monitoring his situation, and it's the same thing. Like what guy are you going to get for $4.5 million? That's not that's better than Nikhil this
Right.
season. And
yeah, that's crazy.
It just all leads to the Wolves are kind of stuck. This offseason, they'll have flexibility, but as it stands right now, they're really just stuck.
All right, let's close by talking a little bit of Wolves Nuggets. We'll do that here next. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends over at TALKSPACE. Therapy is a game changer. It can help manage stress, improve sleep, and communicate more effectively. But finding the right therapist and fitting sessions into a busy schedule can be a challenge. That's where TalkSpace comes in. TalkSpace is the leading virtual therapy provider, making getting the help you need easy, accessible, and affordable. With TalkSpace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours. Plus, it's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your home and even message your therapist between appointments. Plus, TalkSpace is covered by many insurance plans, and for most insured members, there's a $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize mental health. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $80 off your first month with TalkSpace when you go to TalkSpace.com/LockedOnNBA and enter the promo code SPACE80 to match with the licensed therapist today. Go to TalkSpace.com/LockedOnNBA and enter the promo code SPACE80. That's SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's TalkSpace.com/LockedOnNBA, promo code SPACE80. All right, Timberwolves Nuggets play on Saturday for the first time. The Wolves have not seen the Nuggets since November 1st, which is kind of crazy. And they still play them 3 more times this year. Like, the Wolves are done with the Mavs now. They still play OKC 3 times, and they still play Denver 3 times. The first of those remaining 3 games against Denver is this Saturday. It's a matinee, a 2:00 home game. The Wolves beat Denver in Minnesota back on November 1st by 3 points. Excuse me. And that was things were different back then. That was a really nice win for the Wolves early in the season. It brought them to 3-2 at the time. And, looking back at it, like, I guess Denver the rosters haven't changed a whole lot since then. Obviously, a lot of other things have changed. Joe Ingles was in the rotation then, for instance. No DiVincenzo now for the Wolves. Jamal Murray's actually playing really well for Denver lately. Denver really, they've won, They've won 3 out of, actually, if you go back even further, they've won 7 out of 8. They haven't beaten a lot of really good teams along the way. They beat Dallas twice in this streak and the Clippers once, but then otherwise it's like the Nets, the Jimmy Butler-less Heat, the Magic, and the Sixers are their other wins. So it's not like they're beating up on the best teams in the league. And actually, you could go back even further. The only other win they've had over like an above 500 like playoff team, if you don't include like the Hawks and the Pistons because they're mixed in there, you got to go all the way back to like mid-December when they beat like the Kings and the Clippers. They beat the Clippers once since then, and then those Dallas games. So it's not like they've had a relatively easy schedule, but they are playing a lot better. Jamal Murray is looking a lot more like the Jamal Murray from several years ago. It's been a while since we've seen Denver. Andrew, what are your like keys to playing the Nuggets this Saturday?
First, the craziest stat, I just have to say, Jokic has had 4 straight triple doubles without playing in the fourth quarter. And he is 2 assists away from doing it again tonight. Like, he is a efficiency, modern basketball just machine. I guess if I'm looking for something, like, I want to see another good Rob stint. I think this is going to be a challenge of a game for him. Jamal Murray's probably going to hunt him very similar like the Kyrie did. And, we got to see if Rudy can still hold up on Gobert earlier in the season, or not Rudy on Gobert, Rudy on Jokic. Earlier in the season, he did pretty well, if my memory serves right. And Randle, they didn't really do a lot of roaming with him. It was kind of just a Rudy straight up on Jokic. I'm interested to see if that's how they're going to approach it this time, or if they're going to mix in Naz and have more Naz Reid on Jokic. That's, to me, still, anytime they play the Nuggets, we know that at some point we're going to have to play them in the postseason if the Wolves want to get anywhere. So it's always just, how do they handle Jokic, and is it a sustainable way to handle him? That's what I'll be looking for the most part, Rob, and then just what do they throw at Jokic and how effective is it?
Yeah, I mentioned some of the teams they've beaten haven't been great, but to your point, they've been destroying teams. I mean, like they've been winning by a lot of points and a lot of garbage time in these games. And we know how good Denver can be, and they're of course now a few games ahead of Minnesota in the Western Conference. I think a couple areas that the Wolves could will probably be okay in. Well, actually, let me say it this way. So, lately, I think the Wolves have done a much better job on the defensive glass. They've done a much better job limiting second chance opportunities. In fact, we actually saw the Wolves flip the script the other night against Dallas, and Julius Randle had a couple of big offensive rebounds. Mike Conley had a big offensive rebound down the stretch, and that's not typically a big part of what the Wolves do on offense. It's usually the other way around, where they're giving up second chance opportunities to teams, and you obviously can't do that against Denver. Denver is top 10 in offensive rebound rate as a team. And of course, Jokic is a big part of that, but like they've also got wings that rebound the basketball. Like Michael Porter Jr. will grab a couple of offensive rebounds on you. Aaron Gordon, when he's able to play, like they're just a team that's got guys that are active on the offensive glass, and they don't shoot a ton of threes. They're actually dead last in both attempts per game and 3-point rate, but they're third in percentage. And I'd be willing to bet a decent number of those because they don't play super fast. Well, I take that back. Actually, they're higher in pace than I thought they were. But I'd be willing to bet that a lot of their 3-point opportunities are open off of offensive rebounds, or they're just smart threes in transition. Like, it's just a really sound offensive team and we're really well-rounded. They also get to the line a bunch, and the Wolves have actually done a much better job recently as well of defending without fouling, much better than they did early this season. I think that's another thing to look out for. Obviously, Jokic gets the line a ton, and that's a huge part of his game. But if the Wolves can defend without fouling and do their part on the defensive glass, I mean, this should be a really good game. You mentioned Denver is playing as we record this, so each team, nobody's on a back-to-back or anything. The Wolves will have a 1-day rest advantage, but this should be a really fun game on Saturday.
Yeah, it's and like it's a matinee game, so you never really know what's going to happen because these guys aren't used to playing at 2:00 in the afternoon. But again, Target Center is going to bring noise. It's going to be a great atmosphere. People always show up for Nuggets games. And to me, it's just a measuring stick game. I mean, if the Wolves can come out and they can have like a solid win at home against Denver, I think then maybe some of everyone can take a breath of like, okay, they still have it in them somewhere. The alternative though is if they lose by 20, I mean, then what is this season? So yeah. Kind of like I said earlier, you can tell there's just some desperation with the team right now of we know we got to write this and start rattling off wins.
Yeah, and to your point on the matinee thing, like we saw this on Monday on Martin Luther King Day, that like we'll probably have a lot of missed shots early in the first quarter. It's either going to be it could be sloppy defense and a lot of dunks, but it's more likely just a lot of bricks. I think that's probably what we're in for at the start of the game. So, all right, that's all we got for you today on the show. Big thank you for coming on, Andrew, and we'll have you on again here soon. I know occasionally you'll fill in on the postcast over at Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. Anything you want to plug at all? I know you write over at Zone Coverage. Anything upcoming there that you want to talk about?
Saturday, I'm having a kind of fun piece where I dug into Basketball Reference for far too many minutes and into hours on who the Wolves' actual rival is based off of their franchise records and like postseason success. The Wolves haven't had a lot of good seasons, so finding a rival was tough. But if you're interested in that type of stuff of just what do the historical stats say, that'll be out over on Zone Coverage on Saturday.
Are I guess I don't know what your criteria was, but for me, like I grew up watching the Duncan Garnett battles, and the Wolves lost to the Spurs in the playoffs a couple of times at least there too. So to me, the Spurs are probably pretty high up there, even though it doesn't feel like it recently.
Spurs are pretty high up there. The Kings are pretty high up there.
Yep.
It's interesting because now, you think, I mean, this week's Rivals Week, and they played Memphis, Dallas, and Denver.
Yep.
Only one of those teams is up there. I mean, the rest of them are all from the early 2000s, and that might speak more to where the Wolves franchise has been the last 20 years. But
yeah, I guess it certainly does. And I guess those are the three of the teams they've played in each of the last three playoffs, I guess, would be maybe the argument from the NBA standpoint. But yeah, I mean, I guess Memphis knocked them out 3 years ago. Denver knocked them out 2 years ago. And then they beat Denver last year and lost to Dallas. So yeah, that's probably the thinking, but I agree with you. Like you go back to the Garnett area, it's San Antonio, it's Sacramento. Those are the two that really come to mind because Dallas wasn't very good for most of Garnett's, the Dirk years were toward the end of Garnett's time in Minnesota. But anyway, yeah, go check that out over at Zone Coverage. Big thank you for coming on, Andrew, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Appreciate it.
There you have it. My conversation with Andrew Dukowitz. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And of course, a reminder, you can subscribe to the newsletter at lockedondaily.com. One-stop shop for all things Wolves and NBA. The Wolves, as we talked about, play tomorrow, so there'll be a postcast over at Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube with Luke and Jack. Then I'll be back on Monday. We'll talk about the weekend that was. We'll talk about Denver, the Denver game Saturday, and then there's also some interesting Kevin Pelton had some stuff on Friday on ESPN, or I guess it was Thursday on ESPN. Might talk about that Monday. So and we'll also look ahead at the week upcoming. It's a difficult schedule for Minnesota, and hopefully that Nuggets game, as Andrew said, hopefully it's a springboard of sorts, a measuring stick game of sorts for Minnesota as we get closer to the trade deadline and closer to the All-Star break. All right, a reminder that Locked On Wolves is, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Of course, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.